skincare or sunscreen or clothing, we absorb that and it goes right into the bloodstream. Now, a lot of our clothing is plastic, polyester. All of the man-made clothing is plastic, and it's far worse than what we're absorbing in our skin, actually. As you wear these clothing items, they release particles into the air that we inhale and we cannot get rid of.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am very excited to have a very unique guest, one that has traveled the world and met with tribes and people who have lived in a much different manner than we do in our so-called advanced society today. And she has learned many, many different learnings with regards to health and how they live and different diseases that we have in our countries compared to diseases that are maybe non-existent in other cultures. So we have on the line Mary Ruddick, and she has been dubbed the Sherlock Holmes of Health for her unique ability to expeditiously assess and remediate rare neuromuscular conditions that others have deemed impossible. She can regularly be found endangering herself in the untouched corners of the world to learn from and distill the wisdom from the last remaining traditional cultures. She shares her findings and knowledge via her sought-after keynote speeches, 100 plus podcast appearances, her published articles, and her work both in front and behind the camera. She told me she has been to 30 countries already in the past year, and she has gained a lot of wisdom. I'm so happy that she's here to share it with us today. Mary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, it's just an absolutely incredible story. So please, let's start with a little bit of a background of how you got interested and maybe some of the different countries and tribes and cultures that you've studied.
Well, I'll tell you, I've always been interested in culture and in the world. I grew up for some of my childhood in Washington, D.C., where everyone speaks a different language and is from another nation. And my parents had traveled extensively. My dad grew up all over the world. So I was always looking at scrapbooks from everywhere and then reading books from the world as well. And so I knew that about myself when I was little, that I wanted to see the sights and see the world. Always thought I would do it as a research scientist, as a marine biologist. So there was a bit of a turn, but it's been very, very good.
Amazing, amazing. And so, yeah, tell us about what are some of the countries that you've traveled to? What are some of the tribes or cultures that you've been able to study?
I've been to well over 100. In fact, Weston A. Price Foundation was just asking if I could tally it up, but I've never made a list, so I need to refer back to my files. I will do that one day. But a great deal. And really, that was my whole purpose, because I think there's so much dogma with health and diet. And in the dogma, we lose truth of what humans as a species, as an animal, require for optimal health and ideal health. And so part of what I wanted to do was to show many different cultures from many different regions and climates, and the differences, as well as the common threads.
So what are, I guess, what are some of the more fascinating tribes or cultures that you've studied, and what does their health and diet look like compared to maybe a traditional, United States diet?
Well, if we go traditional United States, we'd have to go really Native American. And the Native Americans in North America, ate very different diets from each other, from one group to the next. So while we might think, and I certainly thought this before seeing it with my own eyes, we might think that a culture in a certain region and climate would eat the same as another climate, or the same climate in another region, but it's actually not that at all. You see a great deal of variance. I think one of the best examples is in Kilimanjaro, because there's 27 different communities, or we would call them tribes, in that region, and they all eat wildly different from each other, despite it being the same topography. So there's really quite a bit of that. But I think in terms of the most interesting, I really loved the Kazakh eagle hunters. That was fascinating. I loved the I loved Greenland. I loved the Inuit culture there and the diet. It was very different than I expected. And I would say parts of Latin America as well. There's not any I haven't enjoyed though. So it's hard, it's hard for me to answer. And they are all very unique and very different than I expect going in, even for myself, having seen so many, because we do tend to bring our culture and our imprint of what we know from all the sources coming in. And so it's been surprising each time I go to a new culture, to be perfectly honest.
Mm. So let's maybe dive into one of these. Like the eagle hunters is a super cool name. So what do the eagle hunters do? How do they get their food? What are they eating?
Yeah, they're the most lovely people, the most lovely. I swear, when you are around folks that live and eat in the traditional way, they have it's like a explosion of feel-good chemicals. They're so loving and calm and gracious, and yet you know that they can handle so much more than you. So it's really amazing to be around. But the Kazakhs, so they're called the eagle hunters, and many of them have migrated into Mongolia, and they are nomadic. So nomadic, I always thought as a child that meant that you constantly move, but really most nomadic cultures move between the same 2 places or the same 3 places each year. So it's not as a vagabond as I had thought. They don't use the eagles for hunting food, which is also very interesting. So they go and they catch eagles, which is one of the hardest things to do. FYI, like in the world, I'm actually still floored that they're able to do this. To be able to
How do you catch an eagle? That's crazy.
Do you want to know?
Yes, I do. Actually, I really do.
I can't say that I could do it, but I can tell you how they do it. Okay, so when a child is old enough to start learning how to hunt with eagles, and they have females and males, so girls and boys will learn. The girls are actually excellent huntresses, and that is rare. Across the board. True hunter-gatherers, the females do not do that. I keep seeing a lot of articles purporting that they might, and they absolutely don't. The hormones chase off the animals. Anyway, back to the point. So what they do, okay, when there is a boy or girl coming of age, so it could be anywhere from 8 to 10, they will go to catch an eagle, and they need to catch a baby eagle. So I want you to imagine something. You're in the mountain range, typically where I was on the couple trips, it was between China and Mongolia. There's snow leopards, there's wonderful animals, there's snakes, there's all sorts of things, and you go by horseback. Now, there's not many trees in this region, and the eagles nest at the top of a tree without branches, right? We've all seen that. Well, you know the saying, eagle eye. There's a reason for that. The eagles can see from so far away. It's a bit unfathomable. For instance, I saw 2 eagles kill a wolf once. It was not something I would want you all to see. It made me sad, but I mean, it's nature. It's okay. But they were coming from the top of a mountain that I couldn't see, and they came down so fast. So they can see from very long ranges, right? And what you have to do to be able to get an eagle is to get to that nest, climb up the trunk of the tree, take the baby eagle, climb down and get all the way home before these monstrously sized eagles come at you with their talons to get their baby back, right? It's incredibly difficult. So anyway, that's how it's done. And then once you get a baby eagle, you bring it into the gur, which is their word for like the yurt or tent, and it's raised as a pet. Once it starts to get a little bit older, so it depends what age they get it at, it'll be right outside the tent. And they clip the eyes so it's calm, but it's very dear. It's a very dear relationship. They actually have amazing pets. It's very common for them to have bears as pets, and all sorts of things. Yes.
And I would think they would use the eagles to go get fish for them and bring it back or do something like that, but they don't use it for that purpose.
No, they really just use it for collecting fur in the winter. actually. So in many regions of the world, despite some people's insistence that we use things like plastic for clothing, you will die in many parts of the world if you don't use very specific types of fur, because it's the only thing that can keep us warm enough. And so they use it really specifically for getting types of fur. So they really like fox. They'll put that on the inside lining. I don't know about you, but I've always found costume history, which is fashion for us now, but historical is costume. That's what they would call it. Fascinating. And I used to always wonder with Asian clothing, how did they stay warm, right, in the winter? Because it's just this silk kind of dress. Well, it turns out that the inside is fur lined. So are the boots. The boots are literally the hat, everything is fur lined. It's so warm and so cozy. I never felt cold once there. So yeah, I think their diet is really fascinating, really. And they eat a lot of dairy. They eat horse, they eat yak, and it's very seasonal. But they do wonderful things with the dairy. And then the fur is so nice. I came home with a lot of fur. I usually don't pack a bag home. I usually bring nothing. I brought back an embarrassing amount from Mongolia.
This is fascinating. I mean, not to derail, I'm sure people want to learn about, okay, what's the health benefits? What diseases do they not have there that we are susceptible to? Why is that the case? I'm sure people want to kind of get into that, but I thought it was pretty fascinating and a really cool story there. But I would love to start getting into what are some commonalities that you're seeing in the diets, and are they less susceptible to diseases and illnesses that we are getting?
In my experience, they don't get any disease. They don't catch disease, and they don't have inborn disease either. I'm convinced after all these travels with these communities that we are not meant to either. So I really find if we have anything at all, insomnia, aches and pains, period cramps, whatever it might be, it means that something is out of alignment in our life, right? Which, to be honest, coming back to America now, I just moved back home after so many years, and it is surprising how people are living. I mean, literally nothing is designed around health at all, and not intentionally. It's not like there's someone with puppet strings. It's just that the sheer amount of stress and pressure everyone is under with time and also commitments and financial, it's pretty incredible, even in comparison to Europe and many parts of the world. So it's not surprising, but it is shocking. And it's one of the reasons why I was going around so much, so that I could film some of this. And I'm no videographer, but at least there's a record of how incredibly perfect health, like the incredible health that they are in, and how that's normal, quite normal for all these different cultures across the 6 continents with people. So
it's fascinating. And you can imagine they're probably outdoors a lot more than we are. They're probably going with the natural circadian rhythm. They don't have the stresses of I don't know, do they need to earn money in most cases, or are they just kind of they just get their food, get enough food for themselves, and hunter-gatherer, and just hang out, I guess, right? And do whatever they do as a tribe or a family, right?
That's right. They have all that they need, more than enough. And so they're not without on any level. And you're right about the light. There was a really great study, there was a few actually that came out, testing the nervous system of people in lots of different situations. So a person who's a civilian, when there's a war outside their door, a nurse, a night shift worker, a mom at home, all these different things. And the two that were the most stressful for the human body were not psychologically stressful so much. I mean, one was being a civilian at war, but the other one was simply being inside all day. So emotionally, you might be having a great time watching movies, reading books, working at your computer, but your body is freaking out. And historically, that would actually make sense, because at least as I theorize it, when I try to make a reason for this, in all of human history, if you were away from natural light, that meant you were hiding. And that meant that you were under danger. And so the blood would flow from the primary organs to the feet and to the legs and the hands. The sympathetic would become dominant, meaning that you're not going to sleep well. And your whole system would become ready to move fast. But chronically, that makes you very weak. Right? Short term, it's fine. But if that's chronic, that's a very different thing. So, yeah, you're absolutely right about that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I assume many of these different tribes, like you mentioned, have different diets, right? We've heard about some tribes like in Africa that are just straight, meat eaters and things like that. And then I'm sure there's others that are a lot more plant-based in some cases. What are some of the commonalities that you've seen, right? Assuming that they, again, taking the stance of these people are healthier than the average American, what is it that you're seeing that they're putting in their body differently? And what does maybe an average diet look like in some of these tribes?
Sure. Well, I actually have not seen any plant-based by the definition of it. So let me define it, because what we would see might look very plant-based, but the definition of plant-based or animal-based means that over 51% of the caloric intake is coming from that theory, right? And so even in places like Costa Rica and these places that were thought to be very plant-based, the cooking fat is animal. And cooking fat has 9 times more calories, right? Well, it depends what you compare it to, but yes. So quite a bit more calories. And so because of that, you actually end up with animal-based. So there are the carnivore groups. There's many carnivore groups in the Arctic, in Nordic countries, and Africa, sometimes in places I never would expect because there's lots of plants. So it's not that there's a lack of plants as to why they're eating that way. And each of those eat quite different from each other, although I will say that the Maasai in Africa are quite similar to the Mongolian diet. It is different. The Maasai don't make these amazing cheese cookies. I call them cookies. They taste like cookies. It's only cheese. The Maasai just have the milk and the blood and the meat, whereas the Mongolians do like stews and all these amazing things. So, but they are actually quite similar. Whereas the other ones are very different from each other. And if you look at some of the carnivore groups in the Arctic that I've been to, some will do like reindeer stew, right? And jerky. And then others will be having seal blubber, a lot of it, and wow. Narwhal and these kind of things, maybe polar bears. So very, very different from each other. Contrast that with some of the more plant-heavy ones, like really around the equator. I would say we see a lot more, but we also see carnivore groups there too. So that's why I was saying it's not topography that tends to dictate this. It's more culture and preference.
Very interesting. So what do you think what can we learn from the way that they're eating? And it sounds like they're not eating anything like bread or pasta or these kind of like processed carbohydrate foods. It sounds like it's a lot of meat and fat, right? Proteins and fats. And probably, would you say that most of them are probably on a lower carbohydrate diet, if you would consider such a thing?
Yes, especially in comparison to us now. So the higher carbohydrate groups that I go to see, they eat less than 100 grams of carbs a day, which to me as
that's
a
considered low carb. Yeah, that's considered low carb here.
I think in America it would be considered, it's not traditionally. A lot of Europe eats 100 grams or less too. It's pretty normal to be between like 70 or 80 to 100 in traditional societies if they eat a lot of carbs or eat more carbs than the others. But none of them do the 300 to 600 grams that we do, at least not in my experience. I haven't been to any that do.
Yeah, interesting. And if they do eat carbs, what kind of carbs are they eating?
Oh, well, often starch, which was pretty surprising to me, actually. It's not the greens and the vegetables that we tend to gravitate towards, right? It's not like the broccolis of the world. No diss on broccoli. I personally love broccoli, but that's really not how they eat. They tend to do a starch. So in certain regions, it might be green plantain. That's very common in a certain region of Africa. Then there's things like tapioca Yeah, so typically more of the kind of starch-based vegetable, taro, sweet potato. Even in places like Okinawa in Japan, the traditional starch was not white rice. That's actually pretty recent. It was taro. So those are typically the more common.
Interesting. So are
Yeah.
you, now you also have had a practice for many years where you've helped people overcome certain conditions or illnesses. What are some of the strategies that you then offer to these people? Are you typically telling, advising them to go higher protein and fat and lower carb, or what is your kind of overall thesis on how humans should eat to be healthier?
Well, I'll be honest, I teach over 41 different diets. So even if I get, say, 10 people with the same diagnosis, I may use very different things with them. Primarily because based on how long you've been ill and how severe it is, and how many comorbidities you have with it, you have to be more strict in order to get out. I personally only teach diets that lead to dietary freedom afterwards. So I tend to use more strict ones that are going to shift to the microbiome. My theory is a bit like a bow and arrow, right? You pull it back. So use a lot of discipline, but then you have freedom. I think what I'm seeing a lot of, especially here in our country, I see a lot of allergies everywhere. I mean, nowhere else in the world that I go can you tell a restaurant that you're allergic to things and have them serve you. And here it's like a prerequisite before they even ask for what you'd like, which is lovely in many ways, but it also indicates that we have a lack of resilience, an incredible lack of resilience. And that's not typical for humans. So I tend to teach people things that will get their foundation of health better to where they have a lot of flexibility later. And I think that's important. So I don't use high carb ever because we have so many conditions that are affected by our blood sugar, right? And our metabolic health and all of that. But also because even if I were to give someone who's ill some of the traditional diets that I see, they're going to have a very different reaction to that diet. Their blood sugar is going to spike, whereas a healthy individual, their blood sugar will not spike with those same foods. So it's very often not the foods when we're in a traditional context, right? Not our Frankenfood that we're talking about, but in a traditional context, if I gave someone a green plantain, they should have a very healthy response to that. Their good bacteria should eat that, but I'm not going to see that in most of the people I see, if any at all, not until they get better. So it's very specific based on what's going on in the microbiome.
Interesting. Yeah. So in these different tribes and cultures that you visited, you said you don't see any prevalence of disease. So do they also live to a pretty long age and just kind of dying of normal old age? I would imagine there might be more infections or things where they don't have medical treatment in certain ways that might shorten lifespan there. Or are they living commonly to 90, 100 years old?
Yes, sometimes even beyond that. So in my experience, unless governments, church, education, nonprofits have come in and introduced any kind of food or clothing, they live until a very old age, older than people would believe me if I said, and very healthfully. Actually, the older you get, the more respected you are because you are more capable. You can actually work out better. You can climb that mountain better, and you have the wisdom and the sharp mind. So, no, they're very healthy. In my experience, they only catch infections once something has been brought in. So if a food has been brought in, those kinds of things. But in the groups that I go to see, that's not the case. So, for instance, I was in Ethiopia this year. And when I was there, there was an incredible outbreak of bilharzia and malaria and yellow fever. And there was one other, African sleeping sickness. And it was right in the region I'm in. Now, with bilharzia, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a parasite that lives in the soil. It's often dormant for about 6 months and then you can be in so much trouble. Your nervous system can fully shut down. You'll end up in a wheelchair. You can die. It's pretty serious. And it was all over. Now, I would be in the same soil as people in the city, right? It's not far, right? We're not going far from the city in this area. People in the city are falling ill to this constantly. The tribes can sit down on the soil. They can eat off the soil. They can cover their hands with the soil. They don't get sick. So in my experience, they don't catch infections at all.
Wow. Wow. It's fascinating. So what was, when you were there in Ethiopia, what did a typical day of eating look like for you? I'm just curious.
Oh, well, I went to see, I'd have to look at my notes. It was somewhere between 8 to 12 different groups, and they all eat differently from each other. So when I was in the Omo Valley, which is in the south, or on the border of Kenya as well, I would eat the traditional Ethiopian food, which is the injera. It's a fermented, it's so good. It's like a flat bread, but very, very thin, almost like a French crepe, fermented for 72 hours, made out of the teff grain. And then on top of that, you put your meat stews, your sauteed vegetables, things like that. And then you all eat communal style. So you take a bit in your hand, you go, you grab it, you eat it, and there's a big exchange of bacteria. The food is really good. Always had coffee. Coffee originates from Ethiopia. And although all the tribes I went to were so different and the diets were different, the cultures were different, one thing they all had in common was a coffee ritual for 2 hours every morning where they brew it correctly, basically. And so lots of coffee. And then from there, it would depend what group I was with. So if I was with the Dorze tribe, which is such a lovely tribe, they live up in the mountains, very different than the rest of Ethiopia, I would say. And they have these big beehive-like houses that look almost like an elephant face. And they do this long ferment with something called false banana root, a very long, very sour, again, starch, right? And they ferment it under the ground, under all these leaves. And then they make this, a flatbread would be more like a chewy cracker. Okay, so think like that. It's not thick. And then that is a carrier for your meats and your other foods and things like that. So I would say that, really the pattern I've seen is that either a group is primarily carnivore or they do meat, fish, and starch. There's not a lot of the other things. I would say the things we tend to focus on, the fruits, the vegetables. And that's not to say that there's none of that. There are some groups like the Chaga in Kilimanjaro where they do, but honestly, those are mostly starches too. I have to catch myself. No. So yeah, there's not a lot of that. Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. Costa Rica eats the fruits, but yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. And, there are a lot of people, first of all, I mean, just more and more people that I talk to about carnivore, I have to be careful because some people think it's extreme and then, oh, you're a carnivore guy. And then it's like so extreme for most people. But the more I hear about it and the more I hear people who have been on it, I hear nothing but positive things. So it's actually, pretty incredible. And I also hear quite a few people who have talked about how plants, in some cases, can be toxic to a certain, depending on the plant, right?
Extremely so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm curious, in that case then, what are your thoughts then on different plants? Are there certain plants that you stay away from or advise your patients to stay away from that might be common things that people are eating?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are things that I am not a rigid person. I should put that on the table, but most of the conditions we're dealing with today require a lot of discipline. Now, that said, there are some foods that I don't eat. That would be potatoes. You couldn't pay me. Same with bell peppers and really the nightshade family, I would say, unless it's a hot sauce where it's been fermented. The potatoes and eggplant, the bell peppers, they all have solanines. Solanines are a very difficult toxin to get rid of for humans, and it stays in the body for 60 to 90 days, causing harm to the nervous system, the immune system. It is not a health food. So in regions where potatoes were traditionally consumed, like in Peru, there's an incredible amount of things that they put those potatoes through. If you actually learned like what you have to do to get rid of the solanines, no one would eat potatoes because it takes months of work. You have to have a full-time chef to do that. So no, I don't eat those. I recommend people not eat corn unless it's fermented. It's gone through the 5-stage process that is typical in the Mayan cultures with the nixtamalization and all the rest, because it causes a very serious deficiency where we often think of disease of deficiency to be deadly, and there is that. Like when corn was brought up from Central and Latin America to most of North America around 1900 or so. Not that it wasn't already here, but it wasn't here as a staple. There were certain groups that had it. It wasn't very common. And so when it came up as a mass food, there was an enormous epidemic of deficiency diseases, because if you don't process that plant the right way, you end up with a niacin deficiency. And that, if you just look it up, you'll see it all over the streets right now. You can see it with your eye. You can see the issues that it causes before it gets to a deadly stage. And for me, as someone who works with people that are ill, it's not a blessing to be chronically ill. It is not a blessing. So to have this idea of, oh, well, it's not killing me, is nice when you feel good. But when you're going through every single day heavy and sick with illness and you can't think, you don't really want to live forever with that, right? Or even live out your full lifespan. It's very difficult. Your quality of life is very poor. So I would say most plants that we consume now are not processed correctly. There's some exceptions. Carrots are great. Carrots are fine. And there's a lot of vegetables and plants that I would say a biochemist who's really looked at them would probably not want to eat, but they also have some benefits. So like I like onions and garlic. I like broccoli, but broccoli traditionally was not eaten very much and it was seasonal. It was like spinach. So a lot of what we do with the eating the rainbow and filling your plate is rather naive. It's like we're toddlers in the world with knives. That we can harm ourselves with. And that's kind of what the plants are. Because in the traditional societies, when they have plants, they don't just make a salad with them. They process them for months to get rid of those toxins.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Yeah. And to your point about the corn, to make it worse, now, from what I understand, over 90% of the corn in the United States is GMO corn, which has been genetically modified to withstand heavy pesticide spraying so they can get more out of the crop. So now you're adding a genetically modified organism heavily sprayed with pesticides. So if you are going to eat corn, probably make sure it's organic. But after hearing what you just said, I'm not going to eat any corn here. I wasn't eating much. I really wasn't eating corn anyway, honestly. But
well, I wasn't either until I spent a few months in the Mayan jungle. But they do eat corn, and so that's when I ate it. And if it's done in that way, it's not so bad. Although they're not dealing. Well, potentially they are now. I mean, seeds spread so fast. And when those were released, the genetically modified, do you know that corn is not classified as a food scientifically or by the government? When they genetically modified it, it became classified as an herbicide, not as a food. And it does really cause that to become part of us as well. So it's a pretty big problem, actually. Yeah.
Wow. So it sounds like you're a fan of a carnivore-ish type of diet, or one that's kind of based a lot around meat and fish and those kind of proteins. Would that be right?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good tool, right? It's a really good tool because it has the building blocks of what we need for life. And so most of the people that I see here when I travel around the States, they're suffering a lot. They're on a lot of medications. They don't feel joy, contentment, satisfaction, relaxation, sleep are hard. Basics are hard. Digestion is hard. And so oftentimes what we're really needing in those situations are the building blocks of life, which are found in the amino acids and the fats. And unfortunately, a lot of the advice that we've received has been devastating to our health. In ways that I think will take a long time to discover, because one thing that people very rarely talk about on these podcasts are the cell membrane, or is the cell membrane. Cell membrane, if you don't have a healthy cell membrane, good luck, right? And that is comprised of phospholipids, fatty acids. Now, most of us were raised, if we're over 30, definitely over 20, we were raised being told, do not consume all of these fats in this whole world over here. In fact, don't consume much fat at all. It'll kill you. And yet, if we look at traditional societies, they all eat enormous amounts of fat. Regardless of if they're carnivore, they eat a lot of plants, they eat a lot of fat. And it's never from corn or cottonseed or linseed, none of those. It's always from animals. And so, well, with the exception of some island nations that have the palm and the coconut. But we need those fatty acids for a proper phospholipid cell membrane. And without that, we're in quite a bit of trouble. So, yeah.
Interesting. So for the people listening right now that may be suffering, maybe they're overweight, maybe they're on a couple medications, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I think a lot of Americans are very overwhelmed in general. And so you probably need something pretty simple. So if I was just going to give like a one sentence advice, it would be just eat meat and fish for a few months and nothing else, and dairy, if you tolerate it. That will bring the weight right down. It'll trigger your satiety hormone, which seems to be really lacking in our population, right? Everyone's hungry all the time. And so it would be a little good reset that would be very simple, where you don't need to buy a book or do any of those kind of things. So I think you could probably just go with that. And even with that, you could eat at restaurants, you can eat at friends' houses. It's not about what you, it's more about what you don't eat, right? And so let's say you're on a tight budget and you're also in a rush all the time. Let's say you're a truck driver, okay? You're on the road. You can just get a egg and cheese sandwich and take off the bread. You know, that would be the simplest advice I could give. And that's one that people tend to like. You mentioned earlier that a lot of people tend to like carnivore. I think they like it because they're not hungry for once. And it's simple. You know, they don't have to spend their whole life in the kitchen. And so for those reasons, I think it's rather freeing. It's also one of the few diets that's a little bit more social. You know, you can be at a business dinner, you can be at a nice restaurant and just get like sashimi or steak and just ignore the side dish. So it's socially, it's very easy, I would say as well. Most places you can consume food. I don't know if I've come across any that you can't.
I love that advice. I think that's absolutely great advice. Now, I did want to ask you about dairy. So dairy is a controversial one, right? And obviously, in many of these tribes and cultures, dairy is something very common. But is their dairy completely different than our dairy? I think some people would question, right? It's not the milk you get in the supermarket compared to that milk, the cheese that they have compared to our cheese. So just kind of maybe talk a little bit about that. And do you think dairy is okay for most people? Should they get a sensitivity test first to see if they're allergic to dairy?
Yeah, good question. I don't do sensitivity testing. I think it's a little silly, but if it helps you, go for it. So please don't let me discourage any listener. In general,
why do you, I have to stop you real quick. Why do you not like, I'm curious too. I'm very skeptical of the sensitivity test, but what makes you say that you think sensitivity tests are possibly a bit silly?
I'll tell you. One is that of all the thousands of people that have come to me after getting one, only one saw improvement by eliminating those foods that they tested positive for. So these are different than anaphylactic allergies, right? Those you have to pull out. It's important. When we have a food intolerance, it's an indication of a couple of things. Now, looking at the top allergens, the top 8, they're all lectins, right? Which is a plant toxin. So even if you're looking at dairy or some of the other things, it's because it's in the fat profile because of what the animal is eating, right? And so take eggs. The chicken that's eating 100% of its diet from corn and soy is going to have a lot of lectin in the egg yolk. That is technically a toxin to all humans, all mammals, actually. And so if you've already worn yourself down, maybe you didn't get the best microbiome from your mom, who knows? Whatever it was, you're more worn down, so you're going to notice it more than someone else, but everyone actually should not be consuming that. And in traditional societies, they were not, right? I have a friend in France right now. Take French bread. It's got a law that you have to ferment it for 72 hours. Now, that gets rid of the gluten. Gluten is a lectin, right? So a lot of times these foods, if they're processed correctly, they wouldn't be an allergen. But getting back to the food sensitivity, there's a lot of reasons I say that. And like I said, take it with a grain of salt, because my gosh, we all need so much help. So if it's helping anyone, go for it. Yeah, I don't want to discourage anyone from something that could help. But in my experience, when I order that test and I reorder, I get different results every day. And that makes sense when you understand how the villi and the gut lining and the microbiota work, because based on what you're consuming and based on what's going on with the inflammation and the damage to the villi, you will respond to different things each day. Further, the elimination of things that you're sensitive to does not get at the issue as to why you're sensitive to begin with. And so you start collecting intolerances. You get more and more intolerant. Your list that you have to give to the chef becomes even longer of things that you can't eat. So it makes you more imprisoned, right? So you have that as well. So yeah, for a lot of reasons, but finally, the other one is that one of the biggest food intolerance companies, the labs that would test this, I was being featured in a book. This is like 10 years ago. And so I was interviewed with the creators of the lab, the scientists, and I learned so much. For instance, that doesn't get to the patients or the practitioners. For instance, they would say, the scientists who created these tests, they would say, if someone tests positive for more than 3 items, that means it's not an intolerance. That means they have a chronic infection going on. I can't tell you how many thousands of people have come in my office with a laundry list from those food intolerances. So so that's why.
Interesting. Very interesting. Good to know. I love hearing different perspectives. So, sorry, I interrupted you when you were about to talk about dairy and the potential differences of dairy.
Sure. So traditional dairy would always be an A2 form of dairy, which would be from a Jersey, a Guernsey. There's lots of breeds of cows that produce an A2 beta casein. It's a protein. It's a type of protein. Lectins, by definition, what we were talking about there, because we're going to rope that in, are sticky proteins. So A2 dairy is a great protein. We can digest it great. A1, no. We can't. It is damaging to us. So there are ways to have that removed, but it's not easy. And in America in particular, and in Northern Europe, so in the Nordic countries and Germany, in the UK, definitely in Ireland, Scotland, the cows are either a hybrid or a lot of Holstein, which is kind of what we think of, right? The black and white cow, that kind of thing. Now, those cows were readily used because they produce 3 times as much milk, but they produce the wrong kind of milk for us humans. So most people will start to have issues at some point in their life with that. Now, if you go to France or Spain, you're not going to have that. If you have non-cow, so let's say sheep, which is something I love. I love sheep dairy, no lectin, and that's harmful in that one. So I would say that's the biggest issue that I see. But we also have an issue with potassium deficiency as well. So with potassium deficiency, which is rare, but I do see it maybe 2% of people, potassium deficiency, if you've got that going on and you don't know it, you won't be able to tolerate dairy, regardless of A2, A1. And then finally, we pasteurize it to the tilt. And that means that we're losing the enzymes, we're losing the probiotics that come with it, and all the things that are really on purpose there with nature so that we get healthier when we consume it instead of more weak.
So if you consume dairy in the United States at a supermarket, let's say you can go to a Whole Foods or a Sprouts or something like that, what type of dairy would you be buying yourself?
Oh, well, I'm going to get a lot of sheep. I prefer sheep over goats because although goats don't have the A1 lectin, they eat anything. I mean, if you've ever been to a farm, they'll eat your plastic bags and things. So, yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
I prefer sheep.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I do Jersey. It's actually gotten pretty easy to get Jersey milk and cream. I'm not a milk drinker personally, but I love cream and butter and cheese. So I will
Mm-hmm.
do those things. Yeah. That's typically what I look for. Now, I like to get things locally, and most of the places I go, that's very easy. Even in Ohio, I know the farms here, so I know where to go and get wonderful dairy. This might be what it's like for people who enjoy wine, in that they can really tell the difference between the different ones, and they get their favorites. I have that with dairy.
Mm.
So, so
Nice.
once you get a refined palate for dairy, you kind of hunt that stuff out.
Great, great. Last question. I know you're also an expert in the microbiome, and obviously, different ways that you eat will affect your microbiome. Maybe just real quick, some advice for people listening in regards to things that are wrecking their microbiome, or things that can improve their microbiome, or anything you've learned from studying the tribes versus our traditional diet.
Oh, well, I'll give you the biggest one, which doesn't have to do with diet, but it shifts the microbiome more. That would be daylight. If you
Mm.
don't get enough daylight on your skin and in your eyes, and direct, so not when you're behind a car window or a window in your house, not when you've got a hat on or sunglasses or glasses on or sunscreen. I mean, direct light is incredibly important for the microbiome. We were
Interesting.
all taught in biology that we don't use photosynthesis like plants do, but our bacteria communicate via quorum sensing, which is light and vibration, and they are anywhere from 70 to 90% of our body. Right? It's more us than us. And so that light is incredibly important. And if someone is staying inside while they're ill and eating the most perfect traditional diet, it's going to be pretty tough to get better without that light. So I would say the use of improper lighting in the house, but mostly not being outside enough in any kind of weather.
That's fascinating. I've never heard any. I've heard of the benefits of daylight, and I try to
Mm-hmm.
go out and get daylight. Obviously, don't want to burn your skin, but get enough
Mm-hmm.
daylight without getting burnt. But I have
Mm-hmm.
not heard anyone relate that directly to the microbiome. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a shame it's not taught. Well, hopefully now it is. Hopefully it'll get out now. But yeah, it's very important.
Yeah, yeah. And do you also highly recommend people avoid seed oils? I know eating out in restaurants, it's a big thing. I'm constantly asking, are they cooking it in any oil? Can you make sure they don't cook it with any oil? Because I can only imagine the canola oil and soybean oil or whatever they're using back there. But
Oh
um,
yes, yeah, they all do. It's pretty hard to find anything that doesn't. I think that's why it's so important to eat at home as often as you
yeah.
can. My motto, once you're in remission, bring really good things into your house to cook with. And when you're out with friends, don't worry about it, because there are seed oils. And I know my colleagues would give very different advice, but our socials are very important. They're far more important
Mm,
than people realize.
mm,
For instance, if women don't get together once a week with a group of women, their progesterone doesn't balance. There's all sorts of things that we don't know that are going on there. And so it's appropriate, I find, and this doesn't mean it's appropriate for anyone else, but in my world, I find it's incredibly appropriate to eat beforehand and go for socials, or to say, I'm good. I'm just going to have soda water, whatever, not make your diet a thing when you're out with friends and people. And there's a place for that, especially when you're trying to recover from something. It's imperative. It's honestly very imperative. But if you're healthy, I think the benefit of being around people and having the joy and the community and all of that far outweighs. So while I wouldn't sit down to a plate of fries, I've literally never asked a chef what they're cooking in. I know. I already know.
mm, mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, so that's typically what I do. But again, if you go to a place that's a grill, these kind of things, there's ways to get around it, and it is starting to become more common. But I really think a important goal is to be resilient and not be in a bubble. And so I find a lot of folks can fall into that, trying to control the outside world when they're trying to be healthy and optimize or recover. And I find if you just focus on the things that you can control, that are actually in your hands, what you cook in your kitchen, what kind of clothing you put on, your posture, how you relate to others, your eye contact, how much light you get, all those things. And then if you're well, if you go out and you eat a cheeseburger, no bun, and it's got a bit of that, I think it's fine. Now, I could be wrong, because those seed oils do stay in you for 2 years, and they really damage the cell membrane that I briefly mentioned earlier. So take that with a grain of salt. But I see people get better all the time,
Amazing.
regardless of that.
Yeah. That's really, I'm really starting to connect the dots. This is really cool. The sunlight and these tribes, how they're outdoors, and the sunlight and the circadian rhythm, and then, the foods that they're eating and the quality of the foods, and then the social aspect and how they're constantly connected with their tribes, with their communities. So this has been really, really fascinating to me. Do you have time for one last question, though? Because you just triggered one for me.
Yeah, we can do
about clothes. So I actually have had a lot of podcast episodes. I think we're on over 150 now. I don't think I've heard of, maybe one person has mentioned clothes. So what should we be looking for in terms of clothes? What should we be avoiding? What clothes do you not wear or wear?
Yes, it's massive. Clothing is massive. We absorb more through our skin than we do through our digestion. So whatever we are putting on our skin, whether it is skincare or sunscreen or clothing, we absorb that, and it goes right into the bloodstream. Now, a lot of our clothing is plastic and polyester. All of the man-made clothing is plastic, and it's far worse than what we're absorbing in our skin, actually. As you wear these clothing items, they release particles into the air that we inhale and we cannot get rid of. It bogs down our whole system. Now, many people are familiar that plastic creates a state of estrogen dominance in the body, right? Well, that's our clothing, right? So you could be doing your best to go to the farmer's market and get everything out of plastic and drink out of glass, but you're wearing plastic day in and day out. Your sheets are plastic, your furniture is plastic. All of this is being absorbed and deregulating your hormones. In addition, it damages the microbiome of the skin. Our microbiome of the skin is the largest that we have access to. And when we wear polyesters and nylons and all these things, it actually creates a state of fungal overgrowth. That's why people smell. Deodorant is not needed anywhere I go. So nobody gets stinky feet. This is a very modern issue, this smelliness. So that's really from, if you're at home, if you're listening and you have to change your shirt or wash your armpits or change your socks often, that's either you need to change your clothing or your microbiome is very off. And you'll know that it's balanced when you don't have that anymore. So the other fabrics do the opposite. Silk knit is my favorite. It looks like t-shirt. It's 100% silk, which means it's antimicrobial. All right. So the natural fibers are antimicrobial. They do the opposite. It's good for both winter and summer. Unlike a cotton, I think cotton of the natural fibers is the least beneficial. Not that it's harmful. It's only for summer.
So something that's 100% cotton at least wouldn't have the dangerous stuff that the polyester and nylon would, right?
Yes, although cotton has a lot of spray on it. And some of the first GMO crops were cotton. I don't know if you all read about horrific suicides from all the Indian farmers when those were released, because the crop yield was awful. And so out of pride, there was a mass suicide. It was awful. But yeah, cotton is fine.
So and organic cotton, ideally.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can do vintage clothing. I keep an eye out for that always. I collect so much silk and other things, and then you can get them remade or cut or sew them or tailored. But real fabrics last generations. And so you don't have to continuously replace your clothing. They're not wearing out. They're not getting smelly, all those things. Wool is amazing. Merino is so good. Both wool and silk work for both summer and winter, depending on how it's woven. So those are definitely my personal favorites because I'm constantly living out of a suitcase. So I need clothing that can work in multiple climates. But yeah, I think especially the underwear, the fitness gear, the swimsuits, those are perhaps the worst. Underwear and bras, those are things that we wear all the time too. And then if you take sheets into account, right, our bedding, so many people get hot at night. And if you're even having a polyester blend in there, you won't be able to regulate your body temperature. Whereas if you have silk sheets or flax sheets or linen, your body temperature is regulated. So you're not going to get the too hot to cuddle or get night sweats or any of that. So yeah, it's a big thing.
That is fascinating. I'm so happy that you shared that. And this entire episode has been really amazing. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much, Mary, for sharing your knowledge with us. Where can people learn more from you, follow you? I'm sure you've got some amazing journeys that you share, hopefully somewhere that people can watch and follow along.
Thank you. Just jump on maryruddick.com. That'll link to Instagram and YouTube and all the rest. I try to post to Instagram whenever I have Wi-Fi. And I tend to do so in my stories. So they're up and then out about the tribal things. But now that I'm back in the States, I'm hoping to put more. But yeah, if you go to maryruddick.com, and then my Instagram is Mary Queen of Heart, and you'll find me on YouTube under Mary Ruddick too.
Amazing. This has been so great. Thank you so much. And I hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe. Thank you.